Imagine opening your porch door in -75 degrees Celsius in the frozen heart of northern Canada and finding a wild lynx dragging her 3 tiny kittens through the snow directly toward you, her breath frozen in mid-air, her amber eyes locked on yours with desperate intensity, and you know lynx are predators, dangerous and unpredictable. Yet something in that moment makes you freeze, not from fear but from confusion, because months later, when you're trapped and bleeding and certain you're going to die alone in that same brutal wilderness, that same lynx does something so impossible that when the rescue team finally arrives, they refuse to believe what they're seeing until the scratches and tracks tell a story no one can deny. And the question that haunts everyone who hears what happened is simple but terrifying. How did a wild animal know? And why did she come back? His name was Daniel Frost, 53 years old, former army medic with 2 tours in Afghanistan still carved into his sleep every single night. And he'd moved to this cabin 14 kilometers outside of a settlement so small it barely registered on maps, because after the noise and chaos and endless voices telling him to move on and heal and reconnect, the only thing that made sense anymore was silence. The cabin was old, wood-burning stove, no internet, satellite phone for emergencies he never expected to use, and his days looked identical: wake before dawn, split firewood until his shoulders burned, check the perimeter for wolf tracks, boil snow for water, eat canned soup or freeze-dried rations that tasted like cardboard and memories, then sit by the window watching the endless white stretch into grey twilight. And some days he'd realize he hadn't spoken a single word out loud in 72 hours. He wasn't hiding exactly, but he wasn't living either, just existing in the space between what he used to be and what he couldn't figure out how to become. And the cold helped, because when your skin burns from wind and your fingers go numb splitting wood, you don't have much energy left to think about the things that used to matter. The locals in town knew he was out here, the quiet guy who bought supplies once a month, paid in cash, never made eye contact for long, and they respected the distance because up here people understood that some silence isn't rude, it's survival. Then came the blizzard, mid-January, the kind of cold that turns breath into ice crystals before it leaves your lips, where exposed skin freezes in under 2 minutes, and Daniel had sealed every crack in the cabin, stacked wood by the stove, and settled in to wait it out like he'd done a dozen times before. But around 11 at night he heard something scratching at the porch, not frantic like a bear, not rhythmic like wind-blown debris, but deliberate. And his military instincts kicked in. Immediately, he grabbed the flashlight, pulled his rifle from the rack, led up even though stepping outside for 30 seconds could mean frostbite, and when he opened that door the beam of light caught her, a full-grown Canadian lynx, her thick silver-grey fur coated in snow, and at her feet were 3 kittens so small they could have fit in his palm, barely moving, their tiny bodies shivering violently, and the mother lynx didn't run, didn't hiss, didn't crouch to attack. She just stared at him with eyes that looked almost human in their exhaustion, and dragged one kitten closer to the porch with her mouth, then stepped back as if to say, "I can't save them, but maybe you can." Every rational part of his brain screamed danger, because lynx are solitary, territorial, and unpredictable, and getting between a mother and her young is how people get mauled. But he saw how thin she was, ribs showing under the fur, paws cracked and bleeding, and he realized she must have traveled miles through the storm, burning every last calorie, and still she hadn't abandoned her babies. He stood there for what felt like forever, wind tearing at his face, and then he made a decision that would change everything. He slowly lowered the rifle, stepped back inside, grabbed an old wool blanket and a shallow crate, placed it just under the porch overhang where the wind couldn't reach, then gently, without looking directly at her, he nudged the crate toward the kittens, and to his shock she didn't attack, she watched. He went back inside, pulled out a can of turkey, the last decent protein he had, opened it and set it near the crate, then backed into the cabin and closed the door halfway, just enough to watch through the crack, and for 5 full minutes nothing happened. But then the lynx crept forward, sniffed the food, devoured it in seconds, and carefully, one by one, moved her kittens into the crate and curled her body around them. That first night he didn't sleep, kept the stove roaring, listened to every creak and scratch, and by morning the storm had softened just enough to see her still there, kittens nestled against her belly, and he realized he'd just committed to something that could get him killed, or at the very least make him the crazy hermit the town whispered about. Over the next 2 weeks he developed a routine. Twice a day he'd leave food, canned fish, bits of dried meat, never too much because his supplies were limited and spring was still 2 months away, and he'd melt snow into a shallow pan for water, leaving it just close enough that she didn't have to leave the kittens exposed, and slowly, impossibly, she began to trust him. She stopped growling when he approached, the kittens grew stronger, their eyes opened, and one of them, The smallest, with a crooked ear, started edging toward him whenever he crouched down, curious and fearless in that way only young things can be. He named her in his head even though he knew he shouldn't, called her Scout, and for the first time in years he felt something that wasn't numbness or dread, he felt needed. But trust isn't free, especially not in a place where survival is measured in calories and degrees below freezing, because the town started hearing rumors, livestock missing from a ranch 30 kilometers south, tracks that matched a lynx, and hunters started talking about organizing a culling before breeding season, and Daniel knew if anyone discovered what he was harboring, they'd come with guns and no questions. His food supplies dropped dangerously low. He started rationing his own meals to make sure the lynx had enough, lost 8 pounds in 3 weeks, and some mornings he'd wake up lightheaded and shaking, but he kept going because stopping meant watching those kittens freeze, and he'd seen enough death for one lifetime. Then came the footprints, strange boot tracks circling his cabin just after dawn, too large to be locals, too deliberate to be random, and he found a cigarette but near the tree line, which meant someone was watching, and his old instincts kicked into overdrive. Check sight lines, reinforce entry points, sleep in shifts, but he was alone and exhausted and starting to feel the edges of paranoia creep back in. One morning in early March, when the temperature finally crept above -40 and the sun stayed up past 5 p.m., he stepped onto the porch and the crate was empty, the blanket still warm but abandoned, and the lynx and her kittens were gone. He scanned the tree line, saw nothing, called out even though he felt ridiculous, and the silence that came back felt heavier than any he'd known before, and he realized with a sharp sting that he'd let himself care, let himself hope that maybe this time something he protected wouldn't disappear. Days turned into weeks, the snow started to melt in patches, ravens returned, and Daniel fell back into his old routine, but something had shifted. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore, it was lonely, and he caught himself listening for sounds that didn't come. The town heard about the tracks, some blamed drifters, others talked about illegal loggers pushing farther north, and the local ranger mentioned at the supply store that there'd been reports of armed men near the old mining trails, people who didn't want to be found, and Daniel felt a cold knot of unease settle in his gut because he knew what desperate men were capable of. He started keeping the rifle closer, loaded, and installed a motion sensor near the shed, nothing fancy, just a tripwire with a bell. And he told himself he was being cautious, not paranoid, but sleep became shallow and fractured again. Then one afternoon in late April, he was splitting wood about 100 meters from the cabin, axe mid-swing, when he heard boots crunching through wet snow behind him, and before he could turn a voice said, "Don't move," and he saw 2 men, both armed, faces hard and eyes empty in that way that meant they'd already decided he wasn't a person, just an obstacle. They wanted his supplies, his fuel, his satellite phone, and when he didn't answer fast enough the shorter one stepped forward and shoved him hard, and Daniel stumbled backward over a log, felt his ankle twist and collapse under him, pain shooting up his leg like fire, and he hit the ground hard, skull bouncing off a rock, vision swimming, warm blood trickling into his eye. The taller one laughed, said something about how easy this was, and Daniel's mind screamed at him to move, to fight, to do anything. But his body wasn't responding right, everything felt slow and muffled, and he realized with cold terror that he was about to die the same way he'd lived the last 3 years, alone, forgotten, and completely powerless to stop it. The shorter man raised his rifle, not even angry, just efficient, and Daniel closed his eyes, not because he was ready, but because he didn't want the last thing he saw to be cruelty, but the shot never came. Instead he heard a sound that didn't belong, a deep guttural snarl that turned his blood to ice, and his eyes snapped open just in time to see a blur of silver and fury launch from the tree line, and the lynx hit the shorter man like a freight train, claws raking across his shoulder, teeth sinking into his forearm, and the man screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure shock, and his rifle clattered into the snow. The second man spun, tried to aim, but 2 larger shapes, the kittens now half-grown and fast, burst from the brush, hissing and circling, and the chaos was so sudden, so violent, that both men broke, turned, and ran, the injured one clutching his bleeding arm, and they disappeared into the forest cursing and crashing through branches like prey. The lynx stood between Daniel and the tree line, sides heaving, ears flat, blood on her muzzle, and for a long breathless moment they just stared at each other, and Daniel felt tears he didn't know he had burned hot trails down his cold cheeks because she'd come back, not by coincidence, not by accident, but because somehow in the vast frozen wilderness she'd heard or sensed or simply known he needed her the way she'd once needed him. She didn't approach, didn't let him touch her, just watched until he managed to sit up, until he nodded, a small stupid gesture of gratitude, and then she turned, called her young with a low sound, and melted back into the forest. When the ranger and a medic finally arrived 2 hours later, alerted by a hiker who'd heard the screaming, they found Daniel conscious but concussed, ankle shattered, and when he tried to explain what happened they exchanged glances like they thought the head injury was worse than it looked, but then they saw the tracks, the massive paw prints in the mud, the blood that wasn't his, the torn fabric near the tree line, and the ranger, a woman who'd lived in these woods her entire life, crouched down, studied the scene, and said quietly, "I've never seen anything like this," and Daniel just nodded because what else could he say? Back in town the story spread like wildfire. Some believed it, most didn't, but the two men were found 3 days later at a clinic 200 kilometers south, one treated for deep lacerations, and when questioned they refused to talk about what happened, and the ranger told Daniel privately that predators don't do that, they don't. Remember, they don't return favors, but the evidence said otherwise. Daniel spent 6 weeks recovering, leg in a cast, cabin repaired by neighbors who suddenly didn't think he was so strange anymore, and when he finally returned home he left food out twice a week, never saw her again, but some mornings he'd find tracks near the porch, small and deliberate, and he knew. He still lived alone, still struggled with silence, but it felt different now, less like punishment and more like choice, because he'd learned that even in the coldest, most isolated corners of the world, kindness isn't wasted, it's planted, and sometimes, when you least expect it, it grows into something that saves your life. Comment on her if you believe kindness always comes back, and share this story with someone who believes even the wild remembers loyalty.